All right, welcome. It looks like we've got just a couple folks joining us. We have a couple seats up front, which I know is not the greatest, but if you do want to rest your toes, lots of walking in the Iowa Event Center here the last couple days. My name is Jen Adams, and I'm with the Iowa Department of Education, and I am simply a room helper today. And what a room. I feel like I won the lottery for room support. Very pleased to be here. Again, the presentation is Trauma-Informed School Practices to Support Resilience during times of collective stress and trauma. And this is Dr. Crnobori. I had it and then I lost it. This is Dr. Crnobori. I'm going to get it. Crnobori. I'm very phonetic, so I had to look at the word. Crnobori. Dr. Mary, as I like to call her, even though we just met. She's really good. She's very kind. I already can tell that. So Dr. Crnobori is joining us here from Metro Nashville. As you can see, we do have materials available electronically as well through the application. We are live streaming today. So as Dr. Crnobori presents and talks through our content today, we will ask you if you have questions to use the microphone, or we may need to repeat the question. We're also taking questions online for those who are able to join us for the live stream. Thank you so much for that. And again, I'll let Dr. Crnobori introduce herself and just let me know how I can be of support and service today as well.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And thank you to you all for joining me in this session. I'm so excited and passionate to talk about this topic and to share this information with you for the next, what do we have, an hour and 15 minutes. So I'll try to keep it as engaging and interesting as possible. I never mind. I always like to bring to the forefront what's alive in the room. So I never mind if somebody's like, I have a question right now in this moment that makes sense to ask. Or I'll do my best. I can't make promises, but I'll do my best to save time at the end for Q&A as well. But don't hesitate to raise your hand, interrupt, and we can have a dialogue as well. But given the fact that I will be the one holding the mic for most of the time, if not all of it, I'll be the talking head up here. So I'd just like to share a little bit about where I came from and why I do what I do today. So, certainly our own personal lived experiences make a big difference in understanding the path that others walk. So I do have, more than my fair share of very early childhood adversity and some throughout childhood, but that's not what I want to focus on. More in the professional realm. So I think just generally, I kind of popped out to be a compassionate and caring human being. You all are too, very much so. Otherwise, you would not be in education in this profession, right? So I was working on a bachelor's degree in psychology, and about 20 years ago, or so longer, I guess. The years keep ticking by. But in my program, the professors would ask, we offer teacher certification, special ed teacher certification in the area of emotional and behavior disorders. Do you want to be a certified teacher? And I said, nope. Education, I don't think so. I want to go clinical psych or something like that. But after I finished my undergrad in psychology, didn't learn anything about how to be a teacher at all. Just kind of working on finding a job or deciding what I wanted to do. And a friend of mine from my program said, hey, why don't you, while you're figuring it out, because, waiting tables and stuff, substitute teach at this school that I work at, which was a self-contained school in another state. This happened to be in Georgia. We contracted with surrounding districts for students with severe emotional disturbance. So in that state, they actually put an S. And it's outside of the scope of what we're going to talk about today, I think. But there are issues around that kind of labeling of kids, emotional disturbance, or even emotional and behavior disorders. But that is what we call it in education. So I started substitute teaching, and I fell in love with the students on day one. Within a couple of weeks, the principal said, hey, why don't we offer you a full-time position? And I took it. So I started teaching in a very critically high needs intensive environment on an emergency teaching certification. I just, of course, had to agree to get that master's in certification within, take 2 years or whatever, which I did no problem. But the reason I share that is to say that when I started teaching, I didn't know what I was doing. I was green, right? But on day one, or at least that first week, there were two things that I knew hands down. I knew that every single child, and I taught middle school, and everybody knows that that's the easiest tier to teach, right? Now, these students, typical IQ, right? Nothing wrong with their intelligence level, but they were struggling academically, behaviorally. So on day one, it was crystal clear to me that every single kid in my classroom came from far more challenging life experiences, chaotic instability, disrupted attachment outside of school. And it was just obvious. I mean, we don't always talk about that, but it was so obvious that their experiences were part of why they were there and impacting their day-to-day behavior. And then the other thing that I knew on day one is that what was happening in that building, which was very control and compliance oriented, it was many times very punitive, very behaviorist approach. It was not helping these kids. It was not helping them academically. It sure as heck wasn't helping them socially, emotionally, or behaviorally, at least not enough. And so I taught for about 5 years or so in that setting and in a couple different settings as well. And after 5 years, I wanted to be able to make more impact than I could do just in the classroom. So that brought me to my current city, which is Nashville, Tennessee, to do some doctoral work in the areas that, in the literature at the time and all the publications, the best things we got that really drew me were positive behavior interventions and supports, which I love, behavior analysis. So I became a BCBA. And so I studied those things with the best in the country, right? I still felt like that was not getting to the root of the problem. Those technologies are excellent. They can and should be implemented in a trauma-informed way. They're evidence-based practices. My doctoral program tied me to evidence-based practices forever. That's what we do in education. But it's not the whole story. It is not even close to the whole story. And if we want to get it right for our kids, we've got to understand the deep roots of where some of their struggles and successes and resilience come from. And so when I learned the neurobiological science of trauma around, 20, I was late. I mean, maybe some of you are just learning it now, but I didn't learn that science until about 2014 or so. That was a game changer for my whole career. That just changed the trajectory. I've got these great tools in my toolbox, teaching behavior analysis, positive behavior, all this good things, but this was the direction I wanted to go, to be able to implement those tools and impact others, empower, equip others to implement those tools with a more trauma-informed lens. So I've been the coordinator of trauma-informed schools in Metro Nashville Public Schools for about 5 years, founding and leading a district-wide systems change initiative to propel us forward, spreading this awareness about the impacts of life experiences on our kids' health and development, and of course, school success and lifelong success. We'll talk about that today. It's a little outside of the scope of our content today to talk about what our initiative in Metro Nashville Public Schools looks like. But I'll just say this, that it has blown me away. I could have never guessed in 2016 when I got my first little grant to initiate this work that today now I oversee 80 staff. We have staffed regulation spaces in 72 every elementary school throughout the district. I've got a team of 7 trauma-informed specialists and a manager to do this work in the district, leveraging the power of collective impact, meaning I didn't have a lot of money. Now the district and the city's invested some money in the game, but it's all implemented within really primarily what we already had. So it's leveraging the power of every professional in our school district, whether it's a bus driver, a cafeteria worker, or front office staff, or teacher, or school counselor, or social work, school leaders, principals, and district leaders, and our board, informing and equipping everyone with this information so everyone can make small shifts in their area of expertise. So this work is less about telling anybody what to do. It's instead informing everybody with this information and what it means to be a trauma-informed educator, and then allowing them to go forth and apply that to their field, technology area of expertise. So this is exciting work. I'm so glad that you're here today to hear about it. But since you have to listen to me, I thought I'd just open with that little story. So let's jump right in. Why is this an educational problem at all? Shouldn't we reserve this for the mental health providers to fix in that kind of clinical space, so that, school counselors? Absolutely not. This is not an issue that can be left to mental health providers. Instead, this is an educational issue that, if not addressed in the classroom, in the areas and relationships where kids spend the majority of their time, will never move the needle, and countless kids will have diminished, school success. We know that ACEs, who knows what ACEs are? Awesome. So adverse childhood experiences are highly prevalent. I'll give you some numbers in a second. These things absolutely can and do occur universally across all walks of life, across all the things that typically separate us: socioeconomic status, race, religion, all those things. However, groups who have been historically marginalized for a long time may be at higher risk, or are at higher risk for these things, and the access to healing is not always equal. We'll talk in a couple minutes about the most important things to buffer or mitigate the adversity kids face to prevent it from turning into trauma. But for now, this can and does occur universally, but the access to healing is not universal. And then oftentimes this is an invisible epidemic. So all of you are educators, and your students where you've seen some of those red flags, or you're aware of some of the things that they've gone through. Make no mistake that the things that you're aware of are just the tip of the iceberg. Usually when you're aware of something, there may be much more under that iceberg. And then also, many kids, it's actually also a coping strategy to smile, to be overly compliant or perfectionistic. When we ask, "Are you okay?" it can be a coping strategy to be like, "I'm great." Just because they show up and they're really good at the school game and all that stuff does not mean that they're not going through adversity. We hear countless stories about, those in adulthood where I was going through this thing and nobody knew it, but it's that teacher or that counselor that just treated me with compassion and care naturally. That's what helped pull me up out of the deep, dark hole of adversity and help, me become who I am today. So this can and does occur universally. We need to treat this at the tier 1 level, meaning treat everyone in a trauma-informed way. We're not going around giving ACE surveys to kids. That can many times over cause more harm than good. With the exception if it's done in a clinical setting with, trauma-specific intervention and trauma narratives and whatnot, that could be appropriate one-on-one with education and, help, but not universally. We can screen for symptoms. I am big on behavior screeners if you do that here in Iowa, because we really want to look at symptoms more than the ACEs themselves. But ultimately, this is an education problem because it can and does significantly impact learning and school success. I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But in a nutshell, we as educators have tremendous power to either buffer the impacts of trauma, mitigate that adversity so it doesn't have to turn into symptoms of trauma, and support resilience and learning and growth and school success and lifelong health and wellness. Or, and y'all have seen this in your schools, it exists in every school. We also have tremendous power to take kids and families who already are going through distressing things and further distress or perpetuate ACEs and even re-traumatize at school. So this is just a critically important topic. And I think Dr. Bruce Perry in this quote captures it not with the best of language in every sentence, but he captures it really well. So Dr. Bruce Perry is a leading childhood trauma expert. You may have heard of him, he's written multiple books, and he's one, Boys Raised as a Dog is one of his older ones, but he just co-wrote a book with Oprah, and you may have seen him on 60 Minutes and features with Oprah. But he said, if 20 million people were infected by a virus that caused anxiety, impulsivity, aggression, sleep problems, depression, respiratory and heart problems, vulnerability to substance abuse, antisocial and criminal behavior, retardation, and school failure, we would consider it an urgent public health crisis. Yet in the United States alone, there are more than 20 million abused, neglected, and traumatized children vulnerable to these problems. Our society has yet to recognize this epidemic, let alone develop an immunization strategy. So that's a powerful quote. I've been told, okay, you can stop there with the presentation. Like you just sold, right? Bruce Perry just sold me on it. But he wrote this probably a decade ago, if not, definitely more than 5 years ago. He said this. We've actually come a long way on recognition, right? Our society is now recognizing this problem in a much bigger way. Even 2 years ago, y'all, before the COVID pandemic and some of the things happening in our country now, I wouldn't have had so many people in the room raise their hand and know what ACEs are. So we've come a long way. And then zooming into that last sentence, the immunization strategy. We actually know what kids need to flourish and thrive and develop in a healthy way. So we know what that immunization strategy is. Our plight, our problem is more getting that immunization strategy to shift and change our systems, whether it's our own, micro level classroom system to a huge 86,000, 175 school districts like I work in, or you may work in, or at the state level, and the national level. So it's a matter of helping bring this converging body of scientific disciplines into practice. So you all know what ACEs are. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. So the original ACE survey published in 1998 looks at 10 things. They're categorized as abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, physical neglect or emotional neglect, and household dysfunction. So on the ACE survey, before the age of 18, was a parent or caregiver in your immediate household dealing with a substance abuse problem, addiction? Was one of those people in your lives incarcerated? Were they dealing with a mental illness? Did you witness domestic violence in the home? And that the phrasing of that item is very narrow. Did you witness your mother being treated violently? And then finally, divorce. So as you can see, these are problematic, right? For a couple reasons. One, the phrasing itself makes it very narrow. Let's just take, for example, divorce. Well, many of our kids, their parents weren't married in the first place, so that's irrelevant. What we're trying to get at here is loss of a parent or a caregiver. We've got so many kids being raised by grandparents, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount of research happening now, like the Philadelphia Urban ACEs study. They're upgrading this instrument and making it better. But the point being, these 10 things are very narrow, and they certainly don't come close to capturing all of the things that can go wrong in a child's life. So I'll just give you a minute to look at this slide rather than reading out loud, because I know probably all of you may have seen one or more of these things impacting your students. And what we know, well, actually, let me talk about prevalence really quick before I continue to talk about all the different forms of ACEs. So even when we look at just these 10 things, because it's that survey that's been studied a ton, just using those 10 things, we know that elementary age, in a typical public elementary school classroom here in America, we can expect that at least 50% of students are likely to have at least one of those 10 things. More than a quarter are likely to have multiple ACEs, and at least 6 or 7% are likely to have many. These numbers are based on just those 10 ACE survey items, and these numbers come from before the pandemic, right? So these are grossly lowball estimates. But we know that by high school, at least half or more, or it says nearly, but now post-pandemic, at least half or more are likely to experience 3 or more ACEs. So we know this stuff is highly prevalent. But those things that we've measured historically that happen in the, actually, I'm going to skip forward a little bit, at the individual level, do not happen in a vacuum. There's so much more that can go wrong in our kids' lives. So this image by ACEs Connection captures it really well. So all the things that we've talked about thus far are kind of like the leaves on the tree. That's what's happening in the individual household, but it doesn't happen in the absence of adverse community environments or elements of community environments that can bring more adversity, lack of opportunity, lack of access to quality housing, to quality healthcare, to quality jobs that pay a living wage, substandard wages and poverty. Also, most certainly, historical trauma and intergenerational transmission of trauma, impacts of discrimination and oppression. And then there's a third category too, which is environmental adversity. Unfortunately, this is what the generation we're teaching now is going to have to help us out of. But natural disasters are becoming a way of life more and more. So these could be climate crises. In Nashville, we had, a deadly tornado that ripped through right after March, right after COVID hit. And that tornado, of course, disproportionately impacted our historically marginalized families who had higher levels of poverty, as well as, racial discrimination and whatnot. So that number 2 and 3 are really overlapping a lot. And certainly the pandemic would fit into either, community environments or environmental disasters. So none of these things happen in a vacuum. But what we know, and this is just a quick review because you all have probably heard about the results of the ACE study, we do know that there's this dose-response relationship to some of these, what we call social determinants of health. These things, the things that kids experience, actually impact the way their immune system, brains, and bodies develop. We know that nurture shapes nature. It's not one or the other. The science of epigenetics tells us that when kids are exposed to too much unbuffered stress during development, which is anytime before about 25, it can disrupt development. And so there's this dose response relationship where higher ACEs, and this could be all of the things, particularly when unmitigated or unbuffered by protective relationships and environments, kids with higher ACEs are more likely to have life occurrence during childhood, as well as lifelong physical health problems, health risk behaviors, mental health problems or diagnoses, and diminished well-being and quality of life. I don't want to go too far into review. I could, dig deep on some of those things, but I'm not going to today. I just want to make the point, though, before I leave this slide, to say that this is correlational, not causational. There can be a kid with an ACE score of 9 who had access to the most caring, say, grandparents raising them, or extended family, or pastor in the community, whoever, teachers at school that understood what they were going through and just surrounded them with wraparound supports. They might flourish and be capable of so much more than they would have otherwise without that trauma, versus another kid that had the same 9 ACEs and nobody got it. They were in the foster care system and, they didn't understand their needs. At school, just excluded and punished. Why are you such a behavior problem? Why can't you learn? And didn't get their needs met. And that student might develop trauma. So the key ingredient here is the presence or access of these safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. And without that, they're far more likely to have some of these lifelong physical health, mental health, and quality of life issues. We know that inequities have been deeply amplified by the pandemic, right? Some of our kiddos have gone through this pandemic, whether it was virtual learning, transitioning back, yada, all the things, on a yacht. It's been a great vacation where they had access to, a parent who could stay at home and be that kind of home teacher to facilitate that virtual learning and all the things. Some of our kids, many of our kids, didn't even have an umbrella to weather this storm, and inequities were tremendously amplified. So I want to talk a little bit about oppression in the world, because we just cannot talk about what it means to be trauma informed without acknowledging that these things do exist in our world. Without delving deep into where it may or may not exist, racism and discrimination can occur on the individual or interpersonal level. It can occur institutionally or systemically, structurally weaved into the fabric of our society, historically passed down intergenerationally because of what our ancestors went through. These things can appear as implicit or unconscious bias or little microaggressions in day-to-day, or overt discrimination and racism. Let's not put it all into the implicit bias category, because sometimes it's not implicit too. And there are many forms of discrimination in our world. So generally speaking, classism is intertwined with most or many of these. Classism is another layer when there are other forms of discrimination. But what we're talking about here can be racism, it can be sexism or misogyny, discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and gender, of course, national origin discrimination, ableism, able-bodied folks versus those that have, disabilities, physical or otherwise. There's ageism. Kids fall into that category, as well as elderly, religious discrimination, and xenophobia, which essentially just means discriminating against anybody who's not just like yourself. So without diving deeper into where this can or cannot occur, I just wanted to acknowledge that this is very much a part of what it means to be trauma informed. And in a nutshell, if it's not socially just, it's just not trauma informed. If it's not racially just, it's just not trauma informed. There's a great blog out there right now, and the gentleman, Sean, what's his last name? Ginwright, I think, had written it. And he talked about we need to move from trauma-informed to healing-centered engagement. And I just want to share, that's what trauma-informed is. All of his points were beautiful. And the only, rebuttal I'd have is that that's what trauma-informed is in the first place. This is healing. And if somebody is trying to do trauma-informed work and leaving this out, they're just missing a very important piece of the puzzle. And I would hope that they would continue to learn and expand that work, because it must be included. And we must take this into consideration. But moving along, we know stress and trauma can very much impact so much of our students and our own functionality and adaptive behavior and success. So this is in the words of Dr. Mark Brackett. He is the director of the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence. He recently wrote a book called Permission to Feel. I think he's probably got some other books. He does have some other books out there, but some of you may know that book, Permission to Feel. It's a good one. So stress and trauma can impact so much. Our ability to focus and pay attention, our ability to make good decisions that we choose for ourselves, certainly learning and learning behaviors, relationships and relationship skills, our health, like we talked about before, and our ability to achieve our own hopes, dreams, and goals that we set for ourselves. We're going to talk a little bit more about regulation in a while, and that will come together more then. But a key point that I'll try to hit more than once. I think I've already mentioned it. I'll hit it again probably before our time is up. But what is trauma anyways? What's the difference between adversity, which is the experiences kids have, and trauma, where it's impacting all this stuff and all this stuff, right? The difference is when it's not buffered by those protective, safe, stable relationships, safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. So trauma is not the event itself. I use that, inadvertently or, carelessly all the time. Like, oh my gosh, this person had a car accident. They just went through a trauma, right? But the event itself isn't actually the trauma. The trauma is the symptoms that an individual develops. So one definition I like about trauma is when extreme or ongoing unbuffered adversity results in more stress and emotion than the brain can deal with. So it undermines the ability to cope. It undermines the true potential that an individual has when they don't have access to that, that support network, that help, that lifeline, that understanding and validation from those who get it. So it's not an event itself. It's rather, and this is the other important point about what trauma is, it is a physiological response to one or more overwhelmingly stressful events. So this is a natural biological response to unnatural events. This is predictable. This is not choice behavior or willful defiance. That point right there as an educator, that's it, man. How often in schools when a kid's having problems, whether they're behavior problems, whether they're interaction, relationships, SEL, social emotional type of problems, whether they're learning problems, we pathologize it and we blame the kid. Why are you willfully doing this? Why are you doing this to me so I can't teach my beautiful lesson plan I prepared, right? This is a natural biological response to unnatural events. Kids are not choosing this. Now, let's give the caveat. Does that mean am I up here saying that willful defiance doesn't exist, that no kids are ever willfully defiant? No, I'm not saying that. Sometimes it is, right? But we've got to dig deep and look at the roots of what's going on in this kid's life or what was going on in this kid's life, whether it's chronic and pervasive ongoing now, or whether it's something that happened that hadn't yet been healed, when they were a baby or 5 years ago. We've got to dig deeper rather than just looking at as a behavior analyst, we talk about topography of behavior, just the presenting symptoms, what it looks like. And we really don't look at what's going on inside the kid or what life experiences they brought. And that is a fundamental flaw. We've got to dig a little deeper to understand, and not at face value or service level, just assuming that this is willful defiance just to screw us over, right? So trauma is both a psychological, yes, there are psychological components, of course, but also a physical experience that can interrupt our internal sense of safety, whether we feel safe in this world. So often we have kids that come to our classroom and they have disrupted attachment. And, you've got 10 kids coming in on that first day of school and you're like, hi, I'm Mrs. C. What's your name? And you want a handshake or a hug or a high five or a hug? And every kid's like hug. And then you have that 10th kid that walks in, and 15th and 20th and, a bunch of them, and they don't trust you. Most of the class trusts you on day one. The others, you need 1,000 connections or 100 connections before they can open up and trust and even, talk to you and learn from you. And it's not because of you. It's not personal, y'all. It's not personal. It's because of what's happened in their past. The world has not been safe for them historically, legitimately speaking. And then internally that's being applied to the current situation, and it's not personal. I literally have, maybe not today, but oftentimes, and I'll replace it today now that I'm saying this, I write Q-tip as a little Post-it note on my computer. Anybody know what Q-tip means? No, you don't know. Yep. Quit taking it personally, because it's not personal. especially as educators. So it's about internal sense of safety, ability to trust, threat response. So oftentimes there's this perception of threat in the immediate environment that may or may not actually be threatening, because past environments have been threatening. So this could be termed hostile attribution bias, where we're perceiving hostility or threat in another individual, or, when it's not actually there in that specific individual situation, because it has been there in other or past situations, right? But really our own internalization of the world has a big impact on how we show up in the rooms we're in. And trauma can disrupt connection with ourselves, our own connection with who we are as humans, right? Self-awareness. That's one of the CASEL competencies for SEL. Self-awareness runs deep as adults. Like, that's a lifelong journey. And our kids are just starting to discover just the surface of who they are, right? Our connection with others. We kind of just talked about some of that. And our connection with our environment and the whole world around us. Like, this is our whole life view. And certainly plays into school success. That's why this topic is so deeply important. But I really haven't even talked about school success. And after all, we're at an education conference and we are educators. So again, in the words of Dr. Mark Brackett, this is actually my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes. He says, "The neural pathways in the brain that deal with stress are the very same ones that are used for learning. And if we as a country want our kids to achieve more academically, we can't do it if they're not emotionally healthy." So even if you got into the teaching profession, not because you love kids that much, and I hear this from high school teachers a lot. I'm not discriminating against any high school teachers. No bias there, I promise. But often high school teachers, I just love math. I went into this profession because I wanted to, and that's good. You should love math. That's good. But I want to instill that love for math and all that messy human stuff. That's not why I do this. So I don't have time for that. I'm here to teach math. And if my kids don't care about my math, then they can get out. That's not how we're made. I get it. That's a common perception. That's a common argument, but that is not how we're made. That is not how our students are made. The brain, if the social emotional needs are not met, that will impact the learning needs. We're going to talk more about the brain in a few minutes. But let's just take the original ACE study outcomes and apply it to some of the emerging body of research in the educational sector. So this is emergent, but as you can see, dating back to, I think, 2002, and forth, it is pretty well established now. We need more science, but quite well established that a very similar dose response relationship exists between ACEs and school success. Kids with more, and I'll put the word unbuffered in there, unmitigated, right? Unmitigated by those protective relationships and environments. Higher ACE score is correlated with higher risk for everything we care about and measure in school. What do we care about and measure in school? Y'all measure the same ding dong things that we do. Academics, behavior, attendance, right? We all measure that. Sometimes we measure school culture and climate and, SEL stuff, but we need to work harder at that. Not even just the measurement itself, but actually doing something about it. Because if we measure, school culture and climate, but then we don't do anything about it. If we say, school culture and climate matters, your SEL, health, social emotional health matters, and we're measuring it or not, kids are not going to believe us if the only thing that we measure and do something about is academics, behavior, discipline. So we've got some areas refinement in that area. But anyways, the things that we have always measured, higher ACE score is correlated with lower academic performance, even lower standardized test scores, behavior discipline issues, social emotional challenges, and attendance problems. In fact, in one study from Dr. Chris Blaget out of Washington State University, he showed, and this is upper elementary, lower middle, I think it was like 3rd through 6th grade, a sample of over about 1,200 kids. Students, in comparison to students with 0 known ACEs, kids with 3 or more were 3 times more likely to experience academic failure, 5 times more likely to have severe attendance problems, maybe less surprisingly, 6 times more likely to have school behavior concerns, severe, and then 4 times more likely to have somatic health complaints like my head hurts or my belly hurts that could not otherwise be explained by a medical diagnosis. Those are the things that are like, just get back in your seat because there's work to do here, right? We don't have time for that because there's no medical diagnosis. There's no doctor's note and we don't believe them. We think they're just trying to work avoidance, escape work, right? The thing is, very likely their belly does hurt or their head does hurt, and it's because of stress. Stress is a very real physical happening in the brain and body. So key takeaway in this little section of our conversation here, ACEs do not necessarily equal trauma. There are many types of ACEs that can occur, and they can and do occur universally, but access to healing is not universal. But ACEs do not automatically cause trauma. It's not about the event itself. It's much more about the presence or absence of those protective relationships and environments or positive child experiences. Again, outside the scope of our time today, but check out Dr. Christina Bethel's work. She's out of Johns Hopkins. She wrote for JAMA, Journal, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the pediatric version of the Journal of the American Medical Association, about positive child experiences. So just like there are 10 ACEs, there are also 9, I think, PCEs, positive childhood experiences. But y'all know what those are, right? Y'all know what those are because that's best practice in your classrooms. It's also very much about the meaning we make about the things that happen to us. And kids are relying on us to help them make meaning. In this work, at the classroom level, oftentimes something catastrophic can occur. Maybe there was a neighborhood shooting, maybe there was a natural disaster, maybe there was COVID, maybe there was a death in an individual student's, family or life. And oftentimes educators respond in one of 2 ways because they don't know. The more typical response is brush it under the rug. Let's not talk about it because I don't want to upset him. I'm scared to bring it up because, what if I say the wrong? It's not that I don't care, but I'm not going to acknowledge it because this is school and we got to learn. And I'm afraid that to do something wrong. That's harmful. It's harmful to not acknowledge the very real things happening in our world. And today more than ever, they've got computers in their pockets. Every kid's got access to a whole world on that phone, technologically speaking. And they're like, this isn't relevant to me. Like, if you're not going to talk about the very real things happening in my life at school, and you're just going to teach me about, stuff that's harder to make connections to relevance out of that textbook or whatever, that we're not going to connect with them. The other thing that we may often do is overly catastrophize. The sky's falling, and overly sort of accommodate. And that's not good at the classroom level either. So this is really, I'll talk about asking, listening, validating later. It's not we have to drop everything and do mental health counseling, not at all. But we do want to acknowledge and validate that something's happening and help them make meaning, whether it's through a restorative dialogue or whether it's through just a community circle, morning meeting or a community circle. That's one way.
I wanted to offer, thank you. I wanted to offer a real life example of what you're talking about. My husband is 58. He has an ACEs score of 9. I have an ACEs score of 0. So that's been a learning experience. But he often says the only reason he really survived was because he had a profound hearing loss. His parents couldn't afford hearing aids, so they just sat him at the front of the classroom. And the teachers paid special attention to him because he was like the poor little deaf boy. And they gave him lots of attention. Well, it turns out he also had ADD, he had depression and anxiety and, a lot of other stuff going on. But the 2 things that really saved him were that sitting at the front of the classroom, special attention in every class. And then he's very intelligent. He's Mensa level. His sister, who is 17 months younger than him, same environment, right? Not the same level of intelligence, no hearing loss. Unfortunately, has lived a lifetime of disability, and it's just a very sad story about her life. So 2 kids, same environment, both with very high ACEs scores. But he went on, I mean, not that he hasn't had struggles in life, he certainly has, but he has a master's degree. He's a project manager for our health system. He's doing pretty well, in stark contrast to his younger sibling who it didn't. And that was the difference.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's really impactful personal experience. And so true. And it may be that it's his hearing loss. If he just had the depression and the ADHD, that might have been viewed in a very different way. But because of the hearing loss, there was empathy and compassion and connection. But yeah, the example of 2 kids, same experiences, but totally different trajectory. That's a really important one. So I'll take a couple more quick shares, and thank you for sharing that.
I was teaching math in a high needs Las Vegas high school when the mass shooting occurred. And we, as a community, there were lots of events for the community to attend and to heal and to move forward. But collectively, as a school district, we failed every single one of our students. We did nothing as a school district to support, to counsel, to do anything formalized for our students. And the behavior referrals off the charts.
Interesting. So you noticed your data really shift in the aftermath. No longer do we have the luxury of hiding under a rock and pretending that mass traumas, whether it's, a violent event like Vegas or other things, or could be COVID, no longer can we pretend that those things aren't going to happen. We've got to be prepared to respond. And again, not just the mental health providers. I would venture to say that some kids did get some help because teachers were doing what they knew to do, which was connecting with kids in that classroom environment. The point I want to make in response to yours, because we could think of like crisis response, and I participate in crisis response in my district in different ways, but we think about like mental health counselors coming in the aftermath and doing counseling type of stuff. I want to bring to awareness, or just present a different way of thinking about this also, that actually, we cannot leave this to mental health providers alone. And each one of us that are known and trusted with kids, those who already have relationships, or those who are kind of, Tedeschi, who coined the term post-traumatic growth, I'll talk about in a second. He uses the term expert companions. It's essentially lay people, right, who aren't mental health professionals. It could be a teacher, right? You're not a lay person, you're a professional, but in that realm, giving that sacred space to ask how you're doing, to listen. Listening is the most important thing. And it's processing through, but not necessarily in that mental health space, but it's asking, listening and validating feelings. That can go so far and be so powerful. And as districts and schools, we've got to be prepared to leverage that. I'm going to take 2 more. I've got one here.
You mentioned Dr. Perry earlier, and he's one of my rock stars. I'm not in the educational field as far as in school, but I do national presentations and stuff on trauma-informed care. And there's a quote from Dr. Perry that I think will help encourage everyone in this room. At least I hope it does. He said, trauma changes the biology of the brain, but it only takes one loving, significant, nurturing, stable relationship to change the biology of the brain. And every one of you sitting in this room has that capability to be that one person for that one kid, and that you will be the lifesaver to bring that kid out of the hole.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you for circling back to Perry, and we'll do that again. And also, don't feel like all of that falls on your shoulders. Like now you have to be the mentor and drive them home and all this stuff. You can also serve to connect them to others. So that one caring adult can help connect kids to a network of, others that each provide a little dose of support. So that's such a good point, whether that's peers or, adults or service providers.
So I had read that trauma, and it just makes me do this to what you have up there, is not the event. It's how the person responds, or the coping skills, or the coping mechanisms that individual has in place, which kind of made me just connect too with what our first participant shared about her husband and his sister. It's what are the resiliency coping strategies that in the relationships that those kids have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's the perception of that event. So if you don't mind us using your husband a little bit, since you graciously shared that story, his perception might have been, okay, I've got these things, that aren't easy in my life and hearing loss and whatnot, but, people care about me. That's a point of connection. So I can access that. Whereas it sounds like his sister did not have that. And so her experience of the same events were very different. Yeah. Super important. All right. Thank you all so much for your comments and shares. I'm going to do my best to watch time. So we also, just like, equity and all of the isms, oppression and discrimination, racism, et cetera, we can't talk about trauma without that. We also can't talk about trauma without talking about the positive childhood experiences, like I mentioned, but also resilience and post-traumatic growth. So that's what the trauma-informed work essentially acknowledges the root of the problem. We have a why behind why kids might face, right? So we can move from like, ooh, willful defiance, you're choosing to be a little snot, to, well, you all have probably heard the classic trauma-informed lens is shifting that thinking from what's wrong with you? Why are you screwing up? To what happened to you, and understanding there is a very real root there. But as educators, we do not stop there. This is also about what do you need to succeed, and maintaining high expectations and helping kids be helped, right? Holding kids accountable when necessary, whether it's learning, behavior, etc. But just giving them the supports they need to flourish and succeed and thrive. That's not different than MTSS, y'all, right? Like y'all do MTSS in Iowa, of course, 3 shared models of prevention, right? That's RTI. I mean, that's right. We're already kind of doing that, but we also must recognize post-traumatic growth. So with trauma, we would never wish it upon anybody, right? We don't want these adverse experiences. We wouldn't wish it to happen in the first place, but it's very real and things happen, and they're increasingly happening in our world. Being a realist that these things are there, it's actually a tremendous opportunity to use that power almost alchemically to transform adversity into, let's see if I have I don't have a definition for post-traumatic growth in here, I don't think, but basically post-traumatic growth, maybe I do. Post-traumatic growth is the positive psychological change that some individuals experience after a life crisis or traumatic event. So it doesn't deny the deep distress that happened. It acknowledges that, right? We're acknowledging it, but we are not staying there. That's like 10% of what it means to do trauma-informed care, trauma-informed school practices. People get all screwy with the word trauma, like, oh, you're perpetuating, deficit mindset, and you're overly focused on the bad and the trauma. That is not the case. That's like 10% is acknowledging. Instead, post-traumatic growth posits that adversity can unintentionally yield changes in understanding oneself, others, in the world. And sometimes these can be radically positive changes that couldn't have otherwise happened without the trauma. I personally, I mentioned I have, some lived experiences myself, childhood and adulthood. They were hard. That stunk. Like, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I would not change it for the world. I wonder what your husband would say about that. If he could choose to have 0 ACEs and no hearing loss and all that stuff, if he would choose to do it differently. I personally would not, because I know that I would go through it all again. because I know I would not be who I am today. I would not be able to, hopefully impact my little corner of the world in the way I can today and have such a meaningful, including spiritual, life without that. So that's post-traumatic growth. And it's intertwined with resilience, right? So we want to help kids be resilient, which is just that ability of an individual or a community to rebound, right? To bounce back and rebound. But sometimes resilience can just look like continuing to show up even when we're at our lowest or we're deep in the weeds of chronic, pervasive, complex trauma and stress, right? We know resilience is highly dependent on context. The research shows that clearly. We know that kids who might have lots of adversity in this class where they're connected to the teacher, when they encounter an academic challenge, they're going to ask for help and they're going to push through it. But in this class where they think that teacher doesn't like them or is biased against them or whatever, just treats them like a problem, they are not going to even try. So context matters. Learning depends on this type of academic resilience as well. And that's us. That's us. That's our environments. That's the conditions that we set forth for kids. We know resilience is influenced by stress. And that's the brain stuff. And we know that this is a process that can be learned and supported. We can predict it with that social support and we can cultivate it. So now the last 20 minutes or so. How long do we have, Jen?
We're at 11:26.
Okay, great. We've got about 20 minutes left. So for the last 20 minutes, we're going to talk about what it means to be a trauma-informed educator, a trauma-informed school. And we'll do it through this frame. This is adapted from the Attachment and Trauma Network. So basically what it means to be a trauma-informed educator is this. I'm sorry, I keep blocking you. Trauma-informed schools and educators focus on safety, connection, regulation, and learning. So let's just look at safety for a second. We're not just talking about physical safety. We're not just talking about the aftermath of that Las Vegas shooting, that we're going to make sure that our buildings are physically safe so no active shooters can come in and we do the drills or the tornado drills and all the things for physical safety. It's not just physical safety. We're talking about relational safety. This is where I have to bring up Bruce Perry again too, because we know that poverty is a huge part of adversity, but the thing is, we're not just talking about material poverty. In fact, as long as kids have their basic needs met, if we're talking about homelessness and stuff, that those physical needs can be detrimental to development. But if they have their physical needs met, they've got food and a shelter and healthcare, they don't have to have lots of stuff. But a bigger thing is relational poverty. Relational poverty causes trauma far more than material poverty. So here we're talking about relational safety, right? When there are disruptions in another Bruce Perry term is rupture and repair. Human beings are going to butt heads, y'all. Peer to peer in our classrooms, adults to kids. When small ruptures are going to happen all the time, sometimes even big ruptures, but when they do happen, we repair them by understanding, maybe giving it a little time and space, but then coming back together in a restorative, whether it's a dialogue or something else, we rupture and repair. So we're also talking about emotional safety. That's, overlapped. Behavioral safety. When behavioral mistakes occur, is it safe? Are we going to use discipline to teach and support and ultimately empower with a clean slate? Or are we going to use discipline or punitive discipline to punish and exclude? Raise your hand if you never made a behavioral mistake as a kid. Right? Every single child. I've had one person raise their hand when I asked that in the past as a grad student. I was like, interesting. But you got suppressed in there, right? But yeah, that's part of being a child is making behavioral mistakes. And then we want to teach, help them learn. So, and then academic safety, when academic mistakes happen too. Another piece to trauma-informed schools is connection. Relationship-rich school environments that foster that sense of belongingness. They're inclusive to, where kids come from, what's meaningful to them, what they care about. So it fosters inclusivity and that sense of belongingness. Knowing that connection and safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments are not a luxury, but instead a necessity, an essential requirement for learning and school success. The third one is regulation. So in our last time, I will talk a little bit about regulation so we can all kind of understand what that fully, like what that is. So embedding opportunities throughout the school day to help kids learn to reduce stress and manage emotions. Now, please make no mistake, this is not giving kids skills or, short practices to stay regulated so that then we can perpetuate distress and continue to, have broken systems and just help them cope with like abuse or discrimination or those things. It's not that. I could see how people might think it's misused in that way, but instead what this is helping give all kids skills so that they can stay regulated, so that then they can choose how to respond to meet their own goals, which includes if we're having to combat, abuse or discrimination, to be able to do that in an effective way, responsive, rather than, impulsively reacting in a way that might actually make the problem worse or not help or just like cause further like divisiveness or whatnot. So regulation is really important. And then of course, learning, of course, trauma-informed, we're schools, right? We focus on learning, but we understand, learning should be integrated, should be ambitious, definitely equitable, but also fun. We have lost joy and fun many times over in schools. We have great high expectations, and there are great things happening. But unfortunately, since the mid-90s, in the era of like zero tolerance, high stakes testing, we've become very rigid, let's just say that, I guess, where we've gotten off balance. The humanity has been leached from education, and there's been no time for some of these things, certainly not fun, because in your schools, when kids start to get a little loose, maybe PBIS and everybody has to walk in the one square, right? And we got the kindergartner that's reaching for the handrail. Oh, they get ripped a new one. That's not safe. Like my kindergarten brain, like I see a handrail. I think that's okay. Like it's not a behavior problem. Let's teach them. Ooh, that's kind of germy. That's why we do, But anyways, when kids start to get a little loosey-goosey in your schools, what do teachers do? They start to get giggly, loud, having fun during a learning assignment. But yeah, we nip it in the bud. We better shut that down, because what's the opposite of work? No. What is opposite of play? Sorry. Yeah, work. I'm trying to get that right. We think that this is not playtime, this is work time. So we shut it down. But actually, the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play, neuroscientifically speaking, is depression. Like the same areas light up when we're not at play or not enjoying what we're doing as those that light up in depression on like an fMRI, legitimately. So when we're depressed, what do we not want to do? Yeah, we don't want to work. We don't want to play. We don't want to do anything, nothing. So enjoyability is generally a sign that something's good for the brain or that learning is happening. So we do focus on fun. All right, let's see what I'm missing. So in a nutshell, this is much more of an adult mindset shift. This work is not about fixing broken kids. They're not broken, but their conditions or environments might need a little fixing. So this is our work. Trauma-informed practices is a culture that includes everyone in the building. It's about fixing broken environments and broken systems. So I have shared a practical framework for supporting trauma-informed schools. Some of you may have been fortunate to get one of my 60 copies in the back, but there weren't enough. Fortunately, this is available on the app. So you all have access to it. If your neighbor's got a copy, you can snap a picture of it. Sorry, I didn't bring enough handouts. But this is the practical framework that I do love to share. If you do this for the next 3 years, start with 2 this year and then add on a 3rd or a 4th. Like this is enough work for the next, 3+ years. This also is beautifully integrated within social emotional learning, within positive behavior interventions and supports, within restorative practices. This is not separate or different from those things that you already may emphasize in your schools and districts. So this is not saying like, oh, we're going to stop doing what we're doing and do this. This is integrated and deeply aligned with any of those three, allowing those three to be implemented in a more trauma-informed way, if that makes sense. So I'm going to talk about these 6 things in our last 10 minutes, but not going item by item 6. Just know you have this as a reference alongside the slides in the schedule app, or some of you have that hard copy. So I'm going to talk about it more through the frame of that safety, that connection, and regulation, but I want to hone in on regulation. So I'll move through safety quickly. Again, Bruce Perry, basically what we're looking for, Bruce Perry said, heading straight for the reasoning part of the brain cannot work if a child is dysregulated and disconnected from others, right? What we're looking for in the school day, and this is Bruce Perry, I love this, like this is it. If we had to distill, what does it mean to be trauma informed? We are looking to provide small doses of connection and relationship and regulation delivered frequently and regularly throughout each and every school day for each and every kid. In between moments, small doses of connection and regulation. So talking about safety, the ways we can do this is kind of teaching 101, education 101, predictability and routines, incorporating rituals, greeting kids by name, that kind of stuff. Because we know it's the research is pretty darn clear. The emotional state of a student controls a whole lot: learning, motivation, engagement, memory. And we're just not thinking beings that feel. Instead, we are social feeling beings that think, and relationships and emotions are the fast lane to the brain. So that sense of belongingness is really important. And that includes inclusivity, showing that we care about what's relevant to our kids too, right? Whether that's putting cultural icons on the walls that they care about, the pop stars or the rap stars, whether it's putting flags of HBCUs and other colleges that represent who is in the students who are in our classroom, whether that's putting, maybe a rainbow flag or something like that to be inclusive for all of our students, to show that they're welcome here. That sense of belongingness is important. Rather than going through some of those practices, I'm going to focus on regulation to kind of end our time together. So what is regulation anyways? Regulation, which is often talked about as emotional regulation, it's a physiological state. It's a very real happening in this immediate moment in the brain and body. Another Bruce Perry, when he talks about state versus trait. When we think about regulation, we're talking about immediate state. What is happening with this kid's regulation? Sorry, I keep covering that. Kids' regulation level right now, not their overall trait. Usually they're this way, for the better or for worse. But how about this immediate moment? That's what we're looking at with regulation. So a regulated state is where we feel calm and in control of our emotions and behavior. They're available for learning, right? That's what we want, is for our kids to be available for learning. They can better self-manage their emotions and behavior. Dysregulation is the opposite. So this is where the stress response is heightened. Their lid is flipped. I'm going to talk about that in a second. It's really hard to manage emotions and behavior and learning. It's hard to keep reactions within a typical range. It can look like, frustration, sadness, withdrawal, anger, all of the things. And this is directly tied to executive functioning. Remember where we started? We talked a little bit about IQ. This is an IQ problem, y'all. There's nothing wrong with our kids' IQs. I mean, of course, their disabilities exist. This is an executive functioning problem, because when our lid is flipped, we can't access the IQ that we have. We can't access that executive functioning. And again, Bruce Perry says we must regulate people before we can possibly persuade them with a cognitive argument here in that prefrontal cortex, or compel them with an emotional affect, reach them through relationships and emotions and connection. They've got to be regulated. So what does that mean? This is where I might have to put the mic down. So some of you may have heard of the hand model of the brain. If you have, I'm going to share it again for those of you that haven't heard it before, or if you're hearing it for a second or third time, hopefully you'll benefit too. So basically, is that okay with the mic? Basically, we all have a spinal cord that gives messages from our body to the brain and from our brain to the body. And what we're going to do here is it's a 3-part brain. You can think lizard, mouse, monkey, right? So we all have a brain stem right there at the base of our skull. In this image, it's red. So the brain stem is largely responsible for keeping us physically safe or alive. A lot of our fight, flight, freeze response lives there, but also so do automatic functions like breathing, digestion, asleep or alert states. That's what the brain stem, which lizards just like us have. This is kind of called commonly the reptilian part of the brain. It keeps us alive and physically safe. So when it comes to experiences, if we're walking through the woods and we encounter a vicious tiger about to attack us, what are we going to do? You're going to scream, which might be a fight response, right? You're going to run, flight response. You're going to you're going to have a freeze response and hope that tiger doesn't see, right? Now, any of you, are you going to stop and think, hopefully he didn't see me. I'm going to hide. Oh, I hope I'm fast enough to outrun this tiger and I hope I'm strong enough to take him out. Are you going to stop and think and decide? No, you're not. But your brainstem is engaged. A couple qualities of that brainstem. One, it is highly reliable. It does not fail. We like to think that this thinker is the most reliable part of our brain. It's not. Whoever created us would have never left it up to the prefrontal cortex to breathe, because we'd forget to breathe and we'd die. Our brainstem does that. It doesn't fail. The other thing is that when it's activated, it acts fast. It's a reflex. There's no time to stop and think. But the brainstem is tremendously powerful. That's been around for the thousands and thousands of years since, we were reptiles, evolutionary sense. So that's here. So the brainstem develops in utero, those earliest days and months of life. The next thing that develops is if you take your thumb and loop it over that brainstem, right smack dab in the middle of your brain, that's the midbrain or the limbic system, parietal lobes. This is oversimplification, which is totally okay. It's a model. Amygdala, hippocampus, things like that live there. A lot of this is basically the social emotional health part of the brain. And it asks, am I emotionally and relationally safe? So a lot of that fight, flight, freeze response can be activated too when we're operating in the midbrain, but it's through relationships and emotional safety, but it's still that fight, flight, freeze, or even fawn response. Fawn is we're overly compliant and perfectionistic. And that's an adaptive strategy as a result of trauma as well. And then finally, if you take your fingers, loop it over. By the way, dogs, cats, mice have a midbrain, kind of stops there for them. But monkeys and us, the most obviously sophisticated and advanced humans, we all have a prefrontal cortex. So this is developing later. It's not done growing till about 25. That prefrontal cortex here is that logic, thinking, and reasoning part of the brain. It helps us learn. It helps us be able to stay regulated, all those executive functioning things. And basically, in a nutshell, just in the interest of time, 2 minutes. So the point is that when kids are exposed to too much unbuffered stress and trauma during those developmental years, the lower parts of the brain, whether it's the brainstem or the midbrain, become overly wired, overly active, even enlarged structurally. The amygdala is actually larger. Therefore, they're more likely to flip their lid in the moment. So they don't have access to that executive functioning, logic, thinking, reasoning, ability to regulate emotions, behavior, learning, everything in that moment. Sometimes kids learn that school's not a safe place just by virtue of walking into the school building. They might start to flip their lid because nobody gets me here. And they just think I'm a problem and I can't learn and I don't fit in. And that's now when we're starting to feed the school to prison pipeline and whatnot. But that's outside the scope too. So now I lost my clicker. Oh, I set it up there. So I want to just end on, this slide, what we can do about it. So that's in the 6 things, but we can teach students about their brain. We can teach them that hand model. There's great YouTube videos available. We can, upstairs brain versus downstairs brain. Kids can use that language. We can do a daily emotional check-ins or in the moment. Where are you today? Is your lid down? Are you in your upstairs brain or downstairs brain? We can incorporate brain breaks that allow them that teaches these skills and practices these skills. In the PowerPoint, you'll see some examples of breathing brain breaks, movement and rhythm-based brain breaks. And then the third thing is giving them access to regulation space so they can use these strategies on the spot when they need it. So if you were going to start there, start this work, I would say start there. And I know we're down on time, so I'll end with this, that our regulation level is really important too. Dysregulated kids need highly regulated adults, but this is not always easy to be able to pull them into our calm rather than allow them to pull us into their storm. And so adult wellness and self-care is a fundamental piece of this work. Both our own self-care and wellness. Self-care is not selfish, y'all. It's actually a professional responsibility or an ethical obligation because we're in caring work, service work. And our institutions, our organizations, our schools can also invest in collective care for all of us. So I'll end on wellness and care. And I thank you all so much for taking care of yourself today.